Hey everyone, welcome back to OC Outdoorsman. Well, it's been about 6 years since I last fished this lake. And back then we were out on boats, so really this will be the first time I'll be fishing Lake Crowley on a kayak. Now keep in mind, this lake is huge, and in the afternoons it gets really windy, as you can see from the flag behind me there. So be prepared, bring an anchor with you. As you find pockets of fish or schools of fish, you're going to want to anchor down. Let's take a look at Crowley Lake. Here's a map, and you'll see I already circled the launch and landing point. This is the boat docks. We camped here around Whiskey Bay, but we launched our kayaks from the southern end of the lake. And we took our kayaks all the way up north, past Sandy Point, all the way up to this northern end. The fishing here was hot. They were all over the place, but realize when we got here we saw a number of cars, maybe half a dozen or so, parked along the West Flats here. If you're familiar with Crowley Lake, I'd like to hear your comments below. How do you get there? Is there a way to get up from the 395 to this western bank? Because that would save us a ton of time if we could have just driven to this part of the lake, launched our kayaks, and boom, we're right there. So yeah, again, to get from here to here was an easy 5 miles, and it was a lot of work. But again, if you could just comment below and let me know if you have been here before or how to get here, that would be much appreciated. Keep in mind, this is the first day of the trip, and I had arrived late, so the winds were really blowing, but I still managed to land the Sacramento perch. Unfortunately, I'd left my anchor in the truck, so I was really limited to this eastern side of the lake. The winds were blowing way too hard for me to get to the other side. So the only way for me to stay in place was to tether my kayak to one of these buoys. And here I'm right next to the dam. This is one of the many perks of lake fishing, the ability to just stop, light up a cigar, and relax. Whenever we fish the ocean, it's work. We're constantly moving. There's really no time to do anything like this. So that first day was uneventful. I almost forgot to mention, fishing with me this weekend is Kevin. You can see his red kayak there on the shoreline. But the focus of today's trip will be on finding the fish. We did have one setback. You can see I did have my fish finder, but unfortunately my connections were bad, so it was down. Now, I did have a contingency plan, and that was to follow the boats. This would be no easy task. Those boats went straight for the western side of the lake, which was easily 5 miles away from where we are now. As you can see, the water is really calm. There's no wind. It's a bit after 6, so it's relatively early still. But once we get to the spot, that's where I'll share tips and tricks for fishing this particular lake. Tip number 1, troll. So as you're covering water, you want to make the most of your time exploring this lake. So have something behind you, whether it's a crankbait or a spoon. Have something trolling behind you, and as you can see here, I land the first trout of the weekend. And don't be afraid to experiment. Now, my go-to lure for trolling is this gold Yozuri minnow, but it just wasn't working though for this particular lake. As you can see here, I land a fingerling trout using a gold Thomas Buoyant lure. Here's a better look at this trout. Still a baby, so I let him go. Here we are 5 miles later. We're with all the other boats, and I land my first decent trout of the weekend. I had pinched down the barbs on all my hooks, so releasing them was fairly easy. Here's a better look at this 14.5-inch rainbow trout. As I mentioned earlier, don't be afraid to experiment. So here's tip number 2. Use a mini jig. Now, one of the most frustrating things about mini jigs is that they're so small and light, they're somewhat difficult to cast, and if you do cast them, they don't go very far. Well, if you add a heavier split shot about 2 feet above the mini jig, you'll be able to cast it out much further and cover more water. And it worked effectively here. As you can see, I land this nice little Sacramento perch. Here's a better look at the rig. You can see I'm using a little green mini jig and I have that split shot about 2 feet above it. Now here's some unedited footage from cast to landing. So my next tip, use supersized mini jigs. And by that, I'm referring to the 1/16 of an ounce hookup baits. They are perfect for this lake. So once it's cast out, you want to let it drop and then pull it up a few feet. Notice I'm jigging as I go. And hopefully you'll trigger a reaction bite. Now behind me, you can't really tell right now, but that's Kevin. He's tethered to my kayak. I'm anchored down. He forgot his anchor, so he's right now just tethered to me. And here it is. I've just hooked into something big. You can see the bend in the pole. This was a decent sized fish. So here's tip number 3. Use 2-pound test, but be sure to set your drag fairly loose because the fish here can get pretty big. And if your drag is set too tight, these larger fish can easily break you off. Not sure if I should call this a tip, but more of a must-have. Use a landing net. Now, with the fish of this size, and if you're only using 2-pound test, you're going to need a net to land this fish. I don't know how many times I've seen fishermen hook into something big and then try to land the fish without a net. Oftentimes, the fish will just end up snapping their line. There's no way I would have been able to bring this fish on my boat without a landing net. So here's tip number 4. Have a staging rod holder on your kayak. You need a place to safely store your rod as you're trying to dehook a fish. Again, I don't know how many times I've seen an angler wrestling with a fish only to have it kick your rod right into the lake or into the ocean because, again, you're in really narrow confines and you want to be sure to safely store your rods away from these thrashing fish. Look at this beautiful trout. He measured in right at 19 inches. And I caught him on this yellow and white hookup bait mini jig. At 1/16 of an ounce, it's probably the smallest of the hookup baits, but they work really well. Here's a shot of the campground. You can see that the water is just down the hill there behind my tent. It's a little after 5, so the sun will be going down soon. I'm gonna cast out a few lines to see if I could land anything in this little creek, if you will. After casting out mini jigs and spoons in this part of the lake, there was just too many weeds. I was getting tangled up, so I tried a different tactic here. Now I'm using a slip bobber with a worm as bait, and it just gets slammed by something big. I should have been more prepared. This fish swam right back into the reeds, and then he just snapped my line. So I'm going to bring up my rig here and I'll show you what I set up. This is a very popular technique that's used in Big Bear. It's a slip bobber, and you can see there are 5 elements to this rig. So if you look closely at the very top, you'll find a tiny knot. Beneath the knot, a green fluorescent bead. Then there's a slip bobber. Underneath that is a sliding egg sinker, and then finally a barrel swivel. To the top of the swivel, you'll attach the monofilament, and below it, your fluorocarbon leader. After losing that fish, I realized I really should have swapped out that leader line with something much heavier. I forget how big the fish in this lake can get. Should have been more prepared. Here I hit the lake just before sunrise, and you can see it's still relatively calm. Yesterday it took well over 2 hours to get to that fishing spot, but this morning I know exactly where to go, so it shouldn't take nearly as long. Because I had the wind in my back, I was able to make it to this fishing spot in just over an hour. Here I've cast out a green hookup bait, and I land another Sacramento perch. This one was bigger than the one I caught the previous day. So as you can see, I'm using the green colored hookup bait in 1/16 of an ounce. I like to call them supersized mini jigs because these hookup baits are larger than your traditional mini jig, and they're heavier, so you can cast them out further without having to use a split shot. Perfect for freshwater fishing. Unlike the previous days, the high winds came early. Right around 10:30, the wind gusts were intense, which would only mean a rough ride back to the boat launch. If you recall tip number 1, always be trolling. Well, that's what I'm doing here on the way back to the landing point, and it pays off. I land another trout. He's so small I don't even need a landing net, but it can generate results. It's never fun having to pedal up against high winds like this, and as you can see with the rough water just coming up over the side of my yak, I was getting soaked. But hey, that's part of kayaking. It was just a much rougher ride back to the landing point. After nearly 3 hours of fighting this wind, I could see the light at the end of the tunnel as the boat docks approach. My legs were on fire and I just couldn't wait to get back to the landing point. And finally, I make it back safely to dry land. That had to be the longest, roughest ride I've ever had on any lake. I had to pedal at full strength just to make any progress against this really strong wind. So by the time I made it back here, I was just totally spent. One thing that you should know, Crowley Lake is a fly fisherman's paradise. Because there's so many insects and the trout just feed on the insects that land on the surface, if you fly fish, you're guaranteed to catch a ton of trout. So that's my goal. I need to learn how to fly fish. So I hope you learned a few new things about fishing this particular lake, and I want to thank you for watching, and if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thanks again.